Welcome to Passionate Reply, and welcome to Great Albums. For today's installment, I'll be looking at Rotund for Success, first released in 1989 by the Australian electronic act The Severed Heads. If you're familiar with The Severed Heads, you might be aware that some people consider them to be an industrial band. But as is often the case with such labels, it's one that the artists themselves would reject, not to mention many listeners and fans in turn. I, for one, have heard them described as the industrial version of elevator music, and while I find that hard to imagine, I can sort of see it. Wherever you might fall on this issue, there are certainly strong elements of both synthpop and dance music in much of the Severed Heads catalog, as on one of their best-known tracks, Hot with Fleas. First released on their 1987 LP, Bad Mood Guy, Hot with Fleas won some club play in its own time and remains one of the best-known Severed Heads tracks. Structurally, it's a fairly typical Severed Heads composition, combining sample-heavy, experimental percussion grooves with a slight hint of a playful melody. Despite its danceability, Hot with Fleas also betrays the group's love for the vile and repulsive, chiefly in its imagery of being infested with itchy parasites. The sense of disgust, combined with the heavy, clattering percussion, together make the strongest case for an interpretation of the music as a part of the industrial tradition. But whatever we choose to call this style, the Severed Heads would take an increasingly pop approach on Rotund for Success, without losing all of those more subversive themes. All Saints' Day served as the album's opening track as well as its second single. All Saints' Day is, of course, a feast associated with historical observation of Halloween, which might serve to make the track come across as a little bit spooky. The use of squealing or screeching samples here may be an extension of that theme as well. Perhaps the most noticeable difference between Hot with Fleas and All Saints' Day is that the latter is much more melody-centered. Where Hot with Fleas was content to have its melodic hook either buried in the mix, stuttered into oblivion, or both, All Saints' Day feels more like a pop song that happens to have an out-there percussion track. In addition to some fairly clean and pretty synth work, All Saints' Day also seems to take a step back from some of the more perturbed lyricism from earlier in the Severed Heads catalog, focusing on an individual who seems to struggle with issues of faith. The narrator feels unable to see themselves in the lives of the saints, but also asserts in the song's powerful refrain that they are willing to believe and strive for greatness nonetheless. While not preoccupied with filth, as Hot with Fleas was, there's still a sort of sinister undercurrent to All Saints' Day. Does it imply that the narrator's faith is an impediment in their life, something that holds them back or prevents them from feeling confident? Religious faith is also the main theme of the album's best-known single, Greater Reward.
My wings are not for you. You can hold me all my life, but paradise can take me twice. When I go to my greater reward, it's a throne I'll take on my own.
Both in its actual chart performance as well as in structure and style, Greater Reward is the closest thing to a pop hit that you'll find on ROTUND for Success. While it has a broad similarity to All Saints' Day, it's a bit like All Saints' Day with all of its knobs turned up. Brighter synth, more toy-like percussion, and an enthralling, soaring refrain. Greater Reward feels captivatingly confident, almost swaggering. A real feat for Severed Heads vocalist Tom Ellard, whose distinctively thin or frail voice might be compared to that of Neil Tennant of Pet Shop Boys fame. Another thing the Greater Reward seems to have escalated compared to All Saints' Day is its lyrical subtext. Where All Saints' Day portrays a struggling believer, the narrator of Greater Reward is perhaps a little too confident in their belief, so zealous that they seem to shun the earthly pleasures of love in favor of the titular Greater Reward of the afterlife. It's easy to see how this track more clearly portrays religion as a net negative, even in the face of its simperingly cheerful melody. The track First Steps tackles the theme of religion in a more oblique manner. Of First Steps obviously implies the first attempts of a child to start walking, and the song's remarkably slow, plodding pace also evokes this idea of a hesitant and clumsy attempt at something. It's tempting to interpret the lyrics of the song as being things that might be told to children when they're very young, particularly the refrain, "If you tell lies, an angel dies." This line seems to give a third, independent critique of religion. Not only can it confuse those who want to do good and cause people to neglect happiness during the one life they know they have, but it also plays a role in the indoctrination of young children, with this lyric portraying a spectral punishment that awaits wrongdoers. But the real reason people shouldn't lie is that it harms other people on Earth, right? In another, perhaps fairy tale turn, the narrator suggests visiting somebody where love is money, only to conclude that you can't pay yourself to fill yourself with desire for someone. Perhaps this is a maxim or cliche in some other universe. And perhaps it's true. At some point, no matter what age we are, we have to learn that love isn't a commodity, but rather a feeling that can only be freely given. While I've emphasized the religious themes in this album a lot, not all tracks on Rotund for Success seem preoccupied with it. Take, for example, Big Car. With the longest runtime of anything on the album, even without including a separate 2-minute track that precedes it, simply named Big Car Intro, Big Car certainly feels like something of a centerpiece for the album. It begins the second side of the LP, and it was released as a single, though to significantly less success than the others. Starting off with a frightful crash of breaking glass, Big Car is quick to introduce us to the Severed Head's hallmark hypnotic rhythm, and its plaintive, slightly nervous melody. The narrator of Big Car addresses someone who has perhaps done them wrong in the past, asking them to visit and promising them that never an unkind word need be said about their life overhead. If greater reward projected confidence, then Big Car suggests fragility, with a narrator who seems to be putting on a happy face to disguise their desperation. A more pop-minded listener might read this as a tale of a lover who's been cheated on crawling back to the person who betrayed them. But at the same time, there's nothing that really suggests that this song is about a romantic relationship between the two. I think a lot of Severed Heads tracks fall into this musical uncanny valley, with elements of pop as well as more underground or experimental music, and perhaps to some extent what we choose to interpret in their work has more to do with us listeners than the Severed Heads. At any rate, though it may have some synth-pop DNA, Big Car is far from a typical pop song, with a meandering and mostly instrumental structure. While earlier Severed Heads albums often featured grotesque and gruesome imagery, the cover of Rotund for Success eschews that in favor of an almost pithy or banal design, dominated by a large floating pumpkin. While an argument could be made linking the pumpkin emblem with the theme of All Saints' Day, I'm inclined to interpret it as something created to be aggressively and offensively meaningless, like a corporate logo that's been focus grouped into a semiotic void. The album's title perhaps also suggests a meaningless slogan for some useless product, with the word success serving as a stand-in for anything and everything that the consumer might desire. Much as the Severed Heads' earlier works centered the grotesque, musically, lyrically, and visually, the move towards a cheekily trite cover and title mirror the way this album took their sound into a more subtly mocking direction. Overall, Rotund for Success is an album that snubs the gory details in favor of making a more abstract commentary, and I think the surface-level prettiness that this album offers makes it an enticing first look at an act with a very complex legacy. While the Severed Heads enjoyed a perhaps surprising amount of mainstream acclaim with Rotund for Success, as well as a remix of their earlier track Dead Eyes Opened at around this same time, they would soon fade back into the obscurity that one generally expects of grotesque and experimental music. Their follow-up LP, the more guitar-curious Cuisine with Piscatorial, failed to reach the same levels of crossover interest, and it would become their final release on Network Records before being dropped by the label. My favorite track from Rotund for Success is the enigmatic LFM. What does LFM stand for? Well, I'm really not sure, but the lyrics of this track suggest that we ought to feel the power and the glory of it. Given the religious themes of tracks like All Saints' Day and Greater Reward, it seems possible that LFM is something to put one's faith in even if we don't understand it. But whatever it is, this track's outro is positively sublime, with what sounds like a chorus of chirping birds to play us out. It's rare that you hear such a clearly nature-inspired sound in industrial music, but it really works well here, and reminds me a bit of Gary Numan's Engineers. That's all for today. Thanks, as always, for listening.